Lovers of lore, thank you for joining me for another fun installment of Innistrad Midnight Hunt lore. Today we're going to be covering the story of the death and subsequent rebirth of the Archangel Liesa. Now, in the ancient days on the plane of Innistrad, things were very dangerous for mankind, and the only real hope that they had at all came from four Archangel sisters: Sigarda, Bruna, Gisela, and Liesa. These four archangels had taken up the task of becoming humanity's protectors. They would defend and guide these weak and fragile creatures. So, to best accomplish this, the angels all took up different tasks. Sigarda's job was to protect these fragile living beings from all the dangers that Innistrad had to offer. Werewolves, vampires, demons, devils, angry geists. The list of threats was endless. Bruna's job was to protect the dead, an equally important job when the dead can rise up and destroy the living in multiple forms, either as mindless zombies or rage-filled geists. Either presented genuine problems for mankind. Gisela's job was to fight off monsters that threatened mankind, and Liesa's job was to try and consult and in some ways make allies of these different beasts and threats to mankind. Now, unfortunately for Liesa, her tactics were looked down upon by her sisters. They considered what she did both unorthodox and unwelcome. They essentially viewed the beasts and other creatures she tried to befriend as threats to mankind, and in some ways anathema to their overall goal. She would become friends with vampires, witches, demons, devils, essentially working under the guiding principle of we must know our enemies if we are to destroy our enemies. As a result, the lower class angels that followed the four Archangel sisters looked down upon Liesa and her followers. But ultimately, the four Archangels had a very strong bond of sisterhood, and even though Liesa was viewed as a wayward daughter, she was still their sister. Liesa was not considered to have as much influence as her other sisters, and the flight of angels that followed her was smaller than all the other angels' flights. For hundreds and hundreds of years, these archangels presided over and guided mankind, until one day, due to the planeswalker Sorin, a brand new angel appeared almost instantaneously. This angel was Avacyn. Avacyn was incredibly powerful, but also incredibly rigid in her ideals. Avacyn very much believed in protecting humanity, but in no way did she believe in consorting with demons, devils, werewolves, vampires. They were threats to be eliminated. This proved to be Liesa's downfall. When she ended up forming a pact with the demon lord known as the Buried One, Avacyn decided that Liesa could no longer be trusted and had become a heretic. She was essentially an accomplice to the very evils that Avacyn and the other angels were sworn to defend mankind from. Liesa's sisters agreed with Avacyn that Liesa consorting with the Buried One was a genuine problem, but the only action that the sisters wanted to take was to try and talk Liesa out of it. Avacyn was unrelenting and started her own crusade against Liesa. And unfortunately for Liesa, she stood absolutely no chance against Avacyn. Avacyn single-handedly obliterated Liesa and her entire flight of angels, and forbade even mentioning Liesa. Now, when we come to the current era of Innistrad, it's been over 1,000 years since Liesa was destroyed. At this point, Bruna is gone, Gisela is gone, they've both been destroyed. Sigarda remains, and Liesa is essentially still scattered to the winds and non-existent. At least that's what the people of Innistrad think, but Liesa does exist in an almost intangible form. Liesa's rebirth comes by way of desperation and a demon. Ultimately, what started to happen is because the angels were no longer there to protect in the same way, Avacyn had been destroyed, and the other angels obviously aren't able to deliver protection in the same capacity. So you end up with a proliferation of depravity. You have regular folk, just villagers, who are left defenseless. And over time, these villagers become incredibly desperate and frenetic. It was in one of these nameless villages that the seeds of Liesa's rebirth were planted. The village was in shambles. It had suffered a number of different attacks. Werewolves had come in and torn villages apart. Vampires had brazenly fed on the villagers, and there was no one to defend them. And then to top it all off, after most of the villagers had been wiped out, the few survivors were treated to a ghoul caller coming by the village and reanimating the corpses of everyone's loved ones. This proved to be the breaking point. The remaining villagers banded together and started to research ancient forbidden writings about someone called the Buried Lord. From the writings they found, this was a hidden lord who was wise and desired to stop the movements of the restless dead. In secret, the villagers started to worship this hidden lord. They started to perform different rituals in an attempt to draw him forth. The villagers tried many rituals to summon the Buried Lord, and each one failed. Ultimately, when they had sacrificed their final goat, the villagers gave up hope and shuffled off despondently. Only one of them, by the name of Algie, remained. She was heartbroken. She wanted her children's spirits to finally be laid to rest. She had pinned all of her hopes on this. Her mournful thoughts were interrupted by the sound of something rustling. She spun around to see that their ritual had actually been a success, but not in the way they had thought, as a lovely dark-haired angel in plate mail armor stood in front of her. Algie took a step back fearfully, but the angel raised her hand in a gesture of friendship. Liesa asked Algie, "Do you know what you have done here?" Algie responded, "Yes, we were trying to summon the Deathless Lord, the Buried One." Liesa responded, "You have succeeded. He roams these woods, and he hungers. You have released a great evil upon the world." Algie couldn't keep the panic from her voice. "Are you here to judge me?" Liesa explained, "I am not here to judge you, but I too was once foolish enough to try to treat with the Buried Lord. I was taken in by his lies about bringing peace. But make no mistake, the silence that he brings does not bring peace with it. His bindings do not bring joy." Algie was not prepared to hear this. Her entire hopes rested on the idea that the Buried Lord would make sure that her family would finally get to rest. She had no more time to think about it, though. As Liesa said, "We must act quickly. The Buried Lord is a demon, and he has not fed in 1,000 years. By now, he's probably destroyed all the rest of your village." Algie could see that Liesa had not recovered herself fully and was still somewhat injured from whatever had happened to her in the past. And yet here she was worried about the villagers and wanting to help them. Calming herself, Algie quickly started to rip off parts of her cloak and bandage up Liesa's wounds. As Liesa's wounds were being tended to, she had Algie fill her in on everything that she had missed in the last 1,000 years. What happened to my sisters? Algie sorrowfully explained that her sisters were gone and that only Sigarda remained. The other two had gone mad and been destroyed. Algie also talked about the ever-lengthening nights that they were experiencing and the increased powers of the werewolves and the vampires and how all the different villages in Innistrad were being overrun. After Liesa's wounds had been treated, the two set off together to take down the Buried Lord. Liesa's mind was spinning. The world had changed so much to her. Avacyn was gone. Two of her sisters were gone. And the world of mankind had fallen into the darkness. She was saddened to think that her sisters would never be brought around to her way of thinking, but at the same time, she had to admit that she had been fooled by the Buried Lord. It wasn't enough to turn her from her path, but it was enough to give her pause. The two did not have much difficulty finding a path to the Buried Lord, as villagers' bodies were strewn about as grisly guideposts. They passed by the chewed corpses until they heard the sound of screaming in the distance. Algae recognized the voice, but it was Liesa who charged forwards. Coming into a clearing, they encountered the Buried Lord. When Liesa had first encountered the Buried Lord, she had found him to be intelligent and considered him to be cultured and a being that could be reasoned with. Essentially, a nobleman among demons. He had even claimed that himself. There was nothing noble about him now. The moonlight illuminated the blood that covered his hide. He had one of his claws around a cultist that was futilely trying to pry himself free. Algae was paralyzed with fear the moment she laid eyes on the Buried Lord. "This is what we summoned?" The Buried Lord spoke to Liesa with a deep, gravelly voice. "What a pleasure it is to see you again, my dear." Rage bubbled up through Liesa. "Drop her!" She sprinted the distance between them, leveling her spear. "You've already taken multiple lives. What happened to your talk of peace and cooperation?" The Buried Lord smiled back at her. "Those are words, meaningless in the face of my hunger." As he said it, his head whipped down and tore a chunk out of the villager that he was holding. Liesa had not been able to reach the demon in time, but she drove her spear towards him. He contemptuously swept it aside. Liesa was still weakened from her wound and wasn't able to land a direct blow. The Buried Lord tried to bring Liesa over to his way of thinking. "Don't allow a few lives of some humans stop us from our grand talks." Liesa wasn't going to be fooled again. She started to summon up her angelic energy, focusing it into the tip of her spear. And this time, when she drove it at the Buried Lord, she was able to slice off one of his wings, and his smile quickly turned into a look of shocked pain. The Buried Lord looked down at his wing laying on the ground and said, "I will forgive this attack on me. If you give me that human to feed upon, we can consider this a recommencement of our alliance." That last attack had taken a lot of Liesa's energy, and for a moment, she genuinely considered agreeing to his terms. But ultimately, she realized that there was no way she'd be able to trust him. And after 1,000 years of not being able to protect humanity, she was not going to allow the Buried Lord to destroy Algae. Liesa shot back, "We will speak of this again after I've sealed you away for another 1,000 years. As she said it, she summoned up all of the energy she had remaining in herself and forced it into her spear, driving it deep into the demon's spine. His bellowing shriek almost deafened her. The Buried Lord was undone, every bit of his essence flowing away into the wind. Liesa felt triumphant, but that feeling was not to last. She could sense something was wrong, and it suddenly dawned on her. She spun to Algae to warn her, but it was too late. The Buried Lord burst forth from under the earth, grabbing Algae in his blood-stained claws. Algae, held in the Buried Lord's clutches, started to chant a language that was so ancient, Liesa couldn't even recognize it. These were words from the ancient forbidden documents the villagers had uncovered. As she chanted these words, shadows started to coalesce around her. Unbeknownst to Algae, the ancient chants that she was using were essentially prayers to the Buried Lord. And as a result, the darkness that was coalescing around them started to flow into the demon. His wounds started to heal, and even his severed wings started to regrow. In a panic, Liesa yelled at Algae, "Algae, stop chanting!" The Buried Lord couldn't help but laugh. "Foolish human, why did you stop praising me?" Algae's despair was so thick at this moment that Liesa could feel it flowing through her. Hopelessness and defeat washed over Liesa in waves. Those feelings didn't last though. Algae was made of sterner stuff. Algae looked up defiantly and shouted out, "Liesa, even if it's my life you ask, then I give it." As she said this, Algae slammed the torch she was holding into the Buried Lord's open mouth. Liesa fed on the feelings of defiance that flowed through Algae and the accompanying hope that came along with it. Hope was powerful energy for an angel. and Liesa drank deeply of it. It flowed through her and burst out in a flare of radiance. Warmth and light came with it, and Algae was able to feel it flowing through her. Liesa drew deeply on this power, feeding it into her spear and the blade of the spear, the entirety of her body. It coursed down her arm and in to the neck of the buried lord where Liesa had just jammed her spear. So much power flowed into the buried lord that he didn't even have the opportunity to make a noise. His neck snapped, his body folded in on itself, burning away, crackling, dust falling into the sky, and the buried lord was carried away into nothingness on the winds, his essence scattered for another 1,000 years. Liesa turned to Algae. You have provided me a great service. You've returned me to this world and allowed me to destroy the buried lord. Algae fell to her knees and begged to serve Liesa. And Liesa said, I don't seek your service, I seek your help. We shall create a new host of the dusk, and you shall be a priestess within it. Algae looked up with happiness in her eyes. The Angel of Dusk had returned to Innistrad, and with her, hope. I hope you enjoyed today's lore installment, my friends. If you like what's going on with the channel, then consider supporting us on Patreon. Thanks for coming by. I'll see you for the next installment of lore. And remember, lore is life.